In this video, we're going to be addressing the question, are sit-ups bad for your low back? And I'm going to be sharing with you 5 things you should know about the sit-up. Coming up. Hey, what's up YouTube? It's Coach Remi here. Today we're going to be covering one of the most common abdominal exercises, the sit-up. And I'm going to be sharing with you 5 things that I've learned about the sit-up since my low back injury. We're going to be covering questions such as, are sit-ups dangerous for your low back? And what context may be appropriate to perform sit-ups? All in today's video. Let's begin. The first thing you should know about sit-ups is that we have to look to Dr. McGill's research regarding sit-ups and low back injuries. So if you looked at Dr. McGill's research and all of his work, we know that disc herniations are created by repeated cycles of spinal flexion and extension. So that involves rounding your back forward and then extending backwards. Continuously repeating that cycle over time can induce a disc herniation. And that's why so many people end up with back issues, is because they're constantly engaging in that motion. Now, when we think of the sit-up mimics the same motion. You have spinal flexion and extension. So to just visualize it, I have a little piece of paper here. If we go through flexion and extension over time, eventually what will happen is this will snap in half and your spine will break and you'll induce a disc herniation. So the first issue there with the sit-up itself is that it's mimicking the motion that creates a disc herniation. And if we look to the research itself too, regarding sit-ups from McGill's lab, we know that there's about 3,300 newtons of compressive force placed onto the low back during a sit-up, and that is almost the equivalent of NIOSH, which is the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, for their low back compression limit. So when you're performing a sit-up itself, and when you're equaling that to NIOSH, probably not the best thing to be doing for the average person. Now, obviously everyone's different, everyone's spines are different, so we have to take that into consideration a little bit. But another factor to also consider is the higher stresses in the morning. We know that there's higher bending stresses in the morning because of the added fluid in the spinal discs. So with the added fluid in the spinal discs, if you perform sit-ups in the early morning, there's a greater chance of inducing a disc herniation compared to if you were to perform sit-ups in the afternoon or say evening. So there's just a couple points. Is that the first point you need to understand is that the sit-up itself induces or can induce a disc herniation because of the motion is mimicking the mechanism for disc herniation. Now, I mentioned context is going to be important when it comes to the disc herniation, even though it induces and can induce a disc herniation. So that leads me into the second thing you should know, which is thin spines versus thick spines, and talking about genetics and different adaptations that people can create. So if we take someone that has a thick spine or thick bone, think of like a linebacker or a power lifter that's very stiff and doesn't have maybe the same mobility as someone that's thin spines, which can be a gymnast or someone that's involved in yoga. So when we take the spine through end range flexion and extension, and if we take that thick boned individual, eventually that thick branch or that thick boned individual is going to just break because they're not going to be able to tolerate that mobility. And eventually enough cycles and they will snap and break in half. Just think about taking a big thick branch and breaking it in half. It's just going to snap. Now, if you take someone that's thin boned, they can tolerate that motion much better as long as it's not loaded. And that would be your gymnast or someone that's involved in yoga, which you can see them getting into extreme positions of flexion and extension at times, and that's part of their activity in their sport. So they have created those adaptations and they have the genetics to tolerate those bending cycles. But if we were to apply load, say put a 50-pound weight and then have them do sit-ups, they will break. So when talking about performing sit-ups, there's a specific instance where an individual spine will tolerate that specific exercise differently. We have a thick bone versus thin bone individual. And it really depends on what an individual is trying to create. So the thin boned individual, they may try to create some extra mobility by getting in end range positions by performing sit-ups, for instance. So there's a little bit of a context-specific scenario. But now as we move into my third thing you should know, we're going to talk about a couple more situations and context-specific areas. So first is a bit of a myth, and one of the reasons why people will perform sit-ups is for the purpose of developing a six-pack. Everyone wants six-pack. They love just the visual appearance, but a sit-up itself, well, yes, it trains the rectus abdominis. It primarily targets the hip flexors, and at the same time, sit-ups aren't necessarily going to create a six-pack. Six-pack is created in the kitchen with diet and nutrition. If you really want that visual appearance, your diet needs to be on point. Because if you have a layer of kind of fat over your stomach and you can perform all the sit-ups you want, it's just not going to show. So diet and nutrition is going to be the most important factor there. And what we know kind of about the sit-up already, I'd say there's better exercises out there that you can perform to train the abdominals without inducing a disc herniation. So that's my first point on the six-pack, but now let's look to performance training. Let's look to athletes. Where might the sit-up be appropriate for prescribing to an athlete? Well, we can maybe look to a mixed martial artist. So someone that's on the ground and, they're trying to punch where someone's on top of them, or they got to get off the ground. The sit-up, a type of sit-up or a certain style of training there may be appropriate for that individual to train that motion or that adaptation to kind of produce power off the floor. So there may be a case where, the sit-up, there's a rationale for using it in some case with a mixed martial arts athlete. But if we look at other athletes like a basketball player or a hockey player, basketball players, 7 feet tall, some of them, taking their spines through end range flexion extension, it's not going to end well for these guys because they have some of the highest incidence of back issues already. And if we're going to create a disc herniation just by doing that motion in the gym, it's not going to end well at all for these individuals. Similar with hockey players, a lot of them have back issues just from being in that motion and posture over time. And if we're going to go create that motion or that mechanism that creates a disc herniation in the weight room through sit-ups, it's not going to end well. And there isn't really a performance benefit for these individuals that's going to transfer over to the ice as well. So there's a performance side of things if we look at athletes in terms of sit-ups, where it may be appropriate and not appropriate. And then my third and kind of final context here to think about is fitness testing. The military, police, high schools, some of these individuals require you to perform a sit-up test. I'm not going to say that it's like this universally. A lot of people have kind of walked back on their fitness testing. Things are improving, but there's things that still are outdated and things that maybe I don't agree with, but it could be required to perform some sort of sit-up test. So you may have to train for it in order to pass and get into whatever it is you're looking to do, maybe policing or the military. So there's another context where you may have to engage in performing the motion of a sit-up. Now, the one thing to also consider is that sit-ups themselves, if you perform sit-ups here and there, it's probably not going to be a big deal, but it's something if you perform routinely, and if it's someone that has a history of back issues, that's going to be very, very problematic because you can make a disc herniation worse, or you can create a disc herniation if you haven't already, if you're performing thousands and thousands of it. Perform a few here and there, probably not going to be a big deal, especially if you don't load it and you avoid maybe end range. But we'll kind of talk about that a little bit towards the end of the video, which I'll get into. Now, for the fourth thing that you should know, and this is going to be a little bit separate from the low back, but if we look to the upper back kind of motion and the neck motion, you're getting this rounded forward of the shoulders and the neck going forward when people perform sit-ups. And if you have someone that's already in this posture, you're just going to continuously contribute to this posture, which can maybe lead to some upper back, neck, or shoulder issues, which is kind of separate from the low back, but not something we want to accomplish in a training or strength and conditioning program. Whereas someone that's very extended and has like a really military posture, sit-up may be okay for them. They may be okay if they have this really extended posture. That there may be a context to prescribe some sit-ups for that individual in that case. But again, it comes down to context specific, which is what I want to kind of hit home here with. And that leads me to my fifth and final thing you should know, which is my overall opinion regarding sit-ups. I'm not a big fan of sit-ups. I don't typically recommend them, and I don't use them with any of my clients or individuals that I train. While I do train a lot of people with low back issues, the sit-up, there's just no real rationale for me to use it with the clientele that I work with. And with my back issues and what I kind of went through, the sit-up is just not something that I am a big fan of, and I believe there's a lot more better exercises out there that can produce the same training effect in terms of developing the rectus abdominis and say the hip flexors without inducing the same risk of developing a back issue such as a disc herniation. And some of those exercises can be a partial crunch, where you have just a small crunch, you're working in a small range of motion, you're not going to end range, it's just a small range of motion of spinal flexion and extension, which can be okay. Different planking variations, front plank, side planks, bird dogs, all these exercises are training the core, but they're also sparing the low back, and you're not going to create a disc herniation from doing these exercises. So a lot more safer alternatives out there in my personal opinion, but really it comes down to context and the way you're going to use the sit-up and if it's appropriate for that case or that individual you're working with or for yourself. And that's a wrap for this video. I hope we're able to address the answer as to whether sit-ups are bad for your low back or not. A lot of it's going to be context specific, and while I do believe there's a lot better exercises out there for training the core without inducing the same injury risk that a sit-up may induce, the sit-up in some cases, there may be a context where it may be appropriate to use, but you need to be very precise, and you would have to have a good trainer into understanding why they're using it and what is the purpose and adaptation that you're trying to create. So I hope this gets you thinking about the sit-up, and if you have any questions, comments about sit-ups, about training, about programming exercises, please be sure to leave them in the comments below, and I'll be happy to have a conversation and discussion with you. Okay guys, have a successful and productive day, and until next time, take care.